this, all right? And here you can see there's the bright, the dark, and the gray, all right? Kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what you're seeing here right away is one of the problems in doing k-means clustering, we'll talk more about this, is that you have to tell it how many clusters there are. And there are methods for then trying to figure that out beyond that, but fundamental to k-means is you already know the number of clusters. When you do this type of clustering, you can think of this as quantizing the feature space, right? So those of you familiar with vector quantization, if you do it in multidimensional space, the idea is you essentially carve a continuous space up into a set of buckets. So this clustering is a quantization of our feature space. Even pandas aren't really black and white. They're actually colored. Okay, usually it's like disgusting dirty brown because they're really sloppy eaters. Anyway, so instead of clustering in just the intensity space, we could cluster in RGB space. So this is notionally drawn here, right, where you can see that each point now belongs to a different color cluster. And here they are, and so you're grouping these pixels based upon their color. So now you're doing a quantization in three-dimensional space. Here's a nice example of using color instead of intensity, this original image here, and you can see if you take a look at sort of the clustering based upon intensity over here, it doesn't do a particularly interesting job of segmenting the cabbage from the broccoli, which is something you should always do because you like one and not the other. All right, but over here, you can see that based upon the different colors, you get the different segments. And it's not rocket science, but it's just this idea that you have some things that have the similar intensity, but are very different in their chroma, right? Their colors. And we talked about color space last time. All right. Notice, however, this pepper here and this pepper there, this system does not know at all that those two peppers are distinct, right? Because the only thing it uses to create these clusters is the distance in color space. You might ask, can I do something smarter?
Can I do something smarter?
Thank you very much. Yes, you can include not only clustering in, say, intensity, but you can also cluster. So here we have this little part of the black ear and this dark part of the eye, and you might want them to be in separate clusters. Well, how would you do that? Very simple. Instead of just clustering on intensity, you would add the position as well. So now we have a three-dimensional space of intensity, X and Y, or as shown here, intensity, X and Y. Here we have the black pixels. Together they're low in intensity, but separated in different areas in X and Y, and so you would get a different, two different clusters. And of course, if you've got intensity and you can do position, you can have color and you can do position. And the point here is that your feature vector is getting longer, looking for features that you'd all like, or as many as possible, to be similar in order to say that everything is in the same cluster. So notice that if I include the X and Y here, so for example, these two pixels, this green up on the top left and the green on the bottom left, they can't be clustered in the same segment because they're different along some dimension, namely the Y dimension. All right. So that's the utility of adding these dimensions. K-means, or something like K-means for segmentation, it has some strengths. It's very simple to do. By the way, it's guaranteed to converge. You can sort of show that. But it has some distinct challenges. First of all, it tends to be very memory intensive because you're keeping all of your points and you're shuffling them around in a membership way. Perhaps one of the biggest ones, well, actually there's two big ones. One is you need to tell it K. You need to tell it how many points there are, how many clusters there are a priori. And you can try to discover that, but K-means doesn't know anything about how to do that. It's sensitive to initialization and outliers. And in particular, what it's looking for are nice, essentially spherical clusters where they're spherical in feature space. That is, it doesn't want any point to be too far away. And the problem with that can be illustrated in a figure that looks like this. So here is a figure with two clusters in it, this one here and this one there. Now I've drawn them, or I should say they've been drawn in red and blue to help you think that they should be separate. But if you were to look at that pattern in just black and white, you probably would say, well, there's this bent cluster here, and then there's this bent cluster there. But of course, if you were to run K-means, you would get what's shown here. This would be one cluster, and that would be another cluster because k-means is looking for these spherical clusters. So we've seen, using k-means, that clustering is that segmentation is a form of clustering, and so far we've just clustered in intensity space. And things get more interesting as we either add more interesting dimensions, that is, other descriptors, and also using a clustering algorithm or a way of finding these clusters that's better than just k-means. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Welcome back, Computer Vision. We're going to continue our conversation on segmentation. Last time we introduced it as segmentation as a clustering in feature space, and feature space could include things like positions, so you might get nice segments that are localized within an image. This time we're going to look at some better algorithms than, say, k-means, and then also some better, or I should say, some more extended feature spaces which allow us to do better segmentation. So we said one of the biggest problems with k-means is that it was really sensitive to sort of needing to know how many clusters there were, what k was, and also possibly to the initial conditions that you gave it. So the assumption of k-means is that there are essentially these spherical clumps within feature space. So if you're thinking of these as a probability distribution, the idea is that there would be a couple of modes, peaks, in our feature space that and sort of falling nearby those peaks is a fall off, and that our pixel intensities are distributed according to a probability density function that has these modes. So if you could find the modes, you might be able to segment the image that way. So the approach that we're going to talk about for doing that is called the mean shift algorithm. And we actually introduced this when we were talking about tracking. It's a little bit easier to talk about that when we do it as a clustering. So the mean shift algorithm was designed as a way of finding these modes or these local maxima of density in some feature space. So here, by the way, this is this beautiful pastel image of these houses and as the input image. And what we have here on the right is the plotting of each of these pixels in the LUV color space. Remember LUV color? This is why we're doing this whole conversation after we talked about color, because if I told you LUV and you hadn't heard it, you'd think I was doing RGB. No, it's LUV, right? And you can imagine right away that looking at a picture like this, the color, the chroma is what matters, and the absolute intensity might matter less, right? Because so let's see, using this yellow here, so this is a brighter yellow and this is a darker yellow, but I would like to have them both be in the same color segment. So LUV makes that easier. We're going to use the mean shift algorithm to find the modes within that distribution. By the way, the slides I'm going to show you, I've showed you before, and again, these are all over the internet. It says originally from Ukrainians and Sarl, and if that's who did it, and I thank you for doing these animations because everybody uses them. So the idea of mean shift is the following. Here I have a distribution of points in some feature space. I plop down some region of interest, and that region is drawn here as a circle, but think of it as a Gaussian blob, right? So it actually is more weighted in the middle than it is to the outside. Mean shift tends to work a little bit better if you have a center weighting. The reason for that is if I've got a hard circle on the end, then if I move it a little bit, I might run into a bunch of new points, and that'll change my value quickly. And I'd like things to always be smooth when I move things around. So by having a fall off in the Gaussian, as I get there, those points have a little bit of influence, and then they gain more influence. So what happens is I put down this region of interest, I compute the center of mass, that's the weighted center of mass, and the difference between them, that's called my mean shift vector, and I just shift my mean there. Isn't that a beautiful animation? And what do? I do it again. I compute the weighted center of mass. There it is. New mean shift vector. Shift it. Marvelous. And what do? I do it one more time, and I keep doing this until I've converged. And there are some interesting proofs of convergence under some reasonable assumptions, and that finds you this mode. So how do we apply this to clustering? Okay. Well, basically the idea is you're going to cluster together all the data points that are in an attraction basin of one mode. So what's an attraction basin? An attraction basin is the region for which all the trajectories lead to the same mode, or all the points go there. All right, so here's a very simple example. So here is a set of points drawn from a distribution. And you can tell, obviously, that the idea is that there probably is a mode here and there's a mode there. Great. The question is, which points belong to which mode? And that's done very simply by, if you were to start your mean shift in each of these locations, which mode does it end up at? All right, and that's illustrated in this figure here, right? So here we're showing you the area of which all of the mean shifts get to this mode, the mode on the right. Likewise, everywhere over here, they get to the mode on the left. So it clusters your feature space using these basins of attraction to the two modes. All right. So when we're going to do this for segmenting a color image, what we have to do is define some feature. So maybe we're using just U and V, or maybe U, V, and X, Y if we wanted color and location. We have to initialize the windows at every pixel. That is, every possible color point in that LUV space. Now, would you do every one? No, you would take a sampling of them. You do mean shift until it converges, and then you merge all the pixels, all those initial points, into a single cluster that all end up at the same peak. All right? And so that looks a little bit like this. All right? So here, L and U, this is L and V, okay? These are the actual pixel colors distributed, and if you run your clustering, and here it's being done in this LU space, all right? If you run your mean shift here, okay, you will see all these points going up to that peak right there, and then there's a peak here, and a peak here, and a peak here. Those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 modes here, and that means there's 7 basins of attraction, which means you would end up with 7 regions in the image. So let's take a look at a result. This comes from this nice little database that was published based upon this PAMI paper. Cominici was one of the original developers of mean shift as applied to computer vision. And what you can see here, so here's our original image, all right, and then you apply mean shift, and it does a really fine job, all right? I mean, take a look at this brick structure here. And you see all of those pixels are put in the same region. Likewise, you get this front of this building here. The whole sidewalk is on one cluster with the exception of over this area, right? Well, that's in a dark shadow from the tree. You'll notice the whole shadow has been put into one cluster because the system can't, at this point, know that it's a shadow, all right? But I think you would agree that if you take a look at this picture here and you were to draw boundaries around where the different clusters were, okay, you would probably end up with an image that looked something like that. Here's some more examples of mean shift segmentation result, and you can see it does a pretty good job. You know, take a look at this picture down here. All the water is put into one cluster there. This foliage is broken out nicely, the islands, etc. So if you've got the right feature space, it does a pretty good job of finding the clusters. Finally, I want to show you an example that also comes from that same original database. And again, it has a nice original image here of the mountain. And on the right-hand side are the segmentation results. So the good news is you can see it does a pretty reasonable job. I mean, it pulls out this section, all the section up here that didn't have the snow on it, and maybe this section here as well. But notice all the texture that's going on in here, okay? Well, it's not that that's wrong. It's just less clear that it's right. What I mean by that is it's not totally clear what you're trying to do with this picture that you're carving it up into segments. That was the original idea behind the superpixels. The idea was, let me carve this thing up into little atomic units that I know don't have to be broken up again, but whether I would combine them or use them together in some way depends upon the future processing that you have to do. So often what you'll do is a segmentation step to create these broken up, these regions, and then figure out how to process those regions going forward. So the segmentation then in some sense is a pre-processing step to give you a much smaller set of units to work with. So that's the description of mean shift as applied to segmentation. I will tell you it's a very strong technique. The cool thing is it automatically finds these basins of attraction. So you don't have to tell it how many modes there are. You just tell it, in fact, there's one parameter choice essentially, which is that window size, how big that Gaussian is. There's also, when you talk about that, because you're operating in a feature space, you actually have a distance function, right? Because when my Gaussian is over some